Pauper Players Podcast. Before we begin, before I introduce my guest, I need to take a little bit of time to thank everyone for the tremendous response which I have been so lucky to receive. I also want to give some shout-outs. Shout out to Job, the guy who runs the Castle of Commons website. He has helped me a lot over the past month to understand the basics of podcasting. A previous podcaster himself, his insights have been invaluable and so greatly appreciated. Additionally, I want to thank P. Proteus, one of the more amazing content creators and someone which I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He gave me some great feedback. I also want to thank Alex Ullman for his note as well. And it was taken constructively, Alex, if you listen or get this response. However, unfortunately, I cannot do that. I agree with you that using my real name would help people connect with me, and it would be an easy way for me to grow this space. I do important work for a state government in the Bible Belt, and frankly, I don't think my screen name is going to fly. And there's a long list of rules of social media compliance that I don't want to have to learn by heart. I don't want to have to constantly be mindful and fearful that I'm treading a line. It's easier for me to merely delete every form of social media that I have with my real name and move forward as freestyle. And that's the direction that I'm going to take this. Additionally, again, this space isn't going to be about me. To the best of my ability, it's going to be about my guests. And that's just sort of contradictory with my philosophy and my purpose. It was a fantastic note. I could not agree more with the assessment that if I did use my real name, it would be very easy to help people connect with me. I'm looking to separate my true life and my online persona. I also want to thank He Who Is in the Water for being so generous to edit this podcast. Unprompted, he reached out and offered, and I'm very grateful for that. You may spot He Who Is in the Water on the Pauper leaderboards. That's usually where you can find him. He does make some content with P. Proteus as well. Feel free to check those guys out. He's definitely in the sidebar to the right of this podcast if you're viewing it on YouTube. So those are my shout-outs to start things off. Again, I want to thank everyone who listened, everyone who commented, everyone who subscribed on YouTube. You guys are great, and I can't thank you enough for giving me this space to work with. Joining me today on the Pauper Players Podcast, we have a man behind some bands. Welcome, Nasty.
Well, hello, Mr. Fursal. Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Thank you for reaching out and joining me, man. It was a very welcome surprise to hear from you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a little bit, admittedly, since I've been, a common or, more so stuck name with the format. It's been a few months, but I'm still here. I'm still kicking. I still follow.
So just for the people that are new to Pauper and maybe unfamiliar with your previous work, both content and format related, can you give us just a little bit of an introduction?
Yeah, I guess I can. So my name's Nasty. I'm an MTGO grinder. Again, I've reeled it back in very recent, but what I guess I was most recently per se famous for was creating the blue-black Delver archetype. Some people would call that UBXD. Now, granted, we're about 6 months removed from its heyday. That's the thing that's going to be most stuck with me, presumably, as long as I'm playing Pauper or I'm still around. The other notable thing, I guess, in terms of Magic accomplishments, pro players say, oh, I had 3-4 Pro Tour top 8s, I had this or that. I won an MCQ. I made it. I can't really say much in terms of that, but I do have one Pauper Challenge win under my belt, and I do hold the record for most consecutive Challenge top 8s. Shout out to Methodical, who has it right below me, but I have 6 in a row, so to my best knowledge, that's still a record I hold.
Yeah, that 6 in a row, top 8ing the challenge each and every week, that is pretty sick. My streak is 2, so I mean, back-to-back's tough enough, man. 6 in a row is well, it's nasty, really.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
And just be clear, too, that I heard you correctly in that introduction, were those Pro Tour qualifier top 8s?
No, I've had plenty of Pro Tour qualifier top 8s, and I've moneyed out a couple Grand Prix, and, the this and the that's, but nothing of, overwhelming significance. I can't say, I was the Star City Games points leader 3 years ago, or that, I made it to 3 or 4 Pro Tours. Most of my to-do and most of what I feel at this time was my success, or what I wanted out of Magic at this game, came from the Pauper format. So Pauper's always going to hold that special spot in my heart.
And in addition to all these things, you were one of the better content creators that we've lost in the past year, if not the best. And in my opinion, which again, this platform and this space is not about my opinions, but you were the one that, well, I guess the easiest way for me to put this is that my homepage used to be your Twitch channel.
Oh, well, that's super sweet, and I didn't know that. Part of me feels really bad about taking a step away just from streaming and playing in general, just because people like yourself, a few of my more dedicated fans to either the deck I was playing or just my personality or whatever it might have been, or even just having somebody who had some amount of consistency with their streams. I do feel bad about kind of stepping down or stepping away from all that. If there's one thing I could change, I wish maybe I could go back and still check in every now and then with maybe a little less frequency than before. There's a whole lot of context that we could get into about why I was doing it as much as I was, but that just means a lot to me to hear in general. Now, in terms of the best, I mean, we've definitely lost a couple people. The one that, if I could give a quick shout out to in the past so many months, that I feel the worst about having him go. Now, I'm glad he went for life reasons, because at the end of the day, that's why I kind of went too. But the one that I would say everyone should miss the most is Any New Province. He was definitely by far one of the best for what he was doing and his niche and his angle on it. I think he was one of the best creators between YouTube and Twitch.
Yes, I feel that his contributions to the format should be recognized. He definitely helped grow the game in a positive way, and we are worse off without him in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I, on the other hand, was a little less, while I dirtled around here and there with some lesser popular decks like Turbo Reanimator, in general, though, what he was great at was just making people, his reactions, just him playing, it was all just very enjoyable. He fostered a good community, made Pauper look real good, so that's why he should be missed. Now, I mean, myself, I would probably say that there are other spikes still within this community, but I would say that I probably left some more, something to be desired in a frequent spike streamer. There's others that stream, just it doesn't seem on the spike side. So what I mean, of course, for anybody who's maybe a little less familiar, hyper competitive, or point is to try to get the 5-0s or the 4-1s, the 2-3s aren't good enough. I would say that there's definitely something lost or something left off the table when I took a step back on that, but would I say myself as the best? I wouldn't say myself as the best streamer, but I did enjoy it, and I do thoroughly miss interacting with my regulars from Twitch.
I feel like part of my thought there is simply that you have a personality, and not all Magic players really have personalities so much. Do you feel sort of what I'm saying? You know,
I
like
I feel what you're saying, and I appreciate that because that was one of the things that I wanted to make about my brand or my content. I didn't want to fluff anything. I've always been the type to just say it how it is, or how at least I feel about it, even if it's not how it is. Even I guess a quick aside that we'll get into. But when the one event happened this past spring, I believe it was early March in Los Angeles. It was an actual like Pro Tour qualifier for Pauper. It was the first Pauper one at the Grand Prix. I literally told a Wizards rep to their face, like, hey, I was just like, right now you got me for life, but like I'm not gonna go play Arena because of your flashy animations. I think it's stupid. Like, I'll be happy to play it if you merge all my MTGO gatherings onto it, but until then, like, no, I think your product's just ridiculous. So I've always had a mouth on me, and I've never been afraid to use it. So I get what you're saying there. A lot of things, a lot of people are worried about rubbing people the right way or the wrong way, and I guess I just am a little less on the filter side or the consequence side. So
I believe the term the kids use is based.
yeah, you could say based, you could say political or politically correct. Not actual politics, but in the wholesome sense, like what should be the moral good or what have you. But yeah, I've never been afraid to use the mouth I have on me, I guess, is the main thing.
Well, to thine own self be true. So, I would like to take this opportunity for you to speak about, where you've been, because it's been a good 6 months since I think anyone in the Pauper space has heard from you at all. What have you been up to, man?
Yeah, so it's definitely been a minute, and yeah, so let's just give it the recap of kind of where my life, we're talking about just me as a human, has been for say the past 6 months. So I guess toward the very end of my stream days, which were about within a month or within so many weeks of my six consecutive challenge top 8 run, somewhere at the end of February, I I kind of had this life transition where I stopped just feeling accepting of my current situation. For context, and I believe I mentioned some of this on my stream while I was streaming back in the day, but I guess I'll go into it a little more details on this podcast. So I was living at home, still being a 28-year-old, and also I was several years in. As I've mentioned before, that I work in some capacity for the government. I don't want to say more past that, but
I understand, and I am in a similar situation.
Yeah. So where I was at with it though is I was really feeling the like, well, what have I accomplished? I'm 28. I'm living at home, and this isn't a knock on anybody listening who might still be in a similar situation. Not all homes are bad, and life isn't the same for anybody, and there's no right or wrong. Just for me, speaking about myself as a human, I would say that I felt like I was, for lack of better terms, underachieving in the life sense. Okay? And again, that's not to say other people who are still might be at home listening at 28. This isn't my call to you saying, hey, do better or get better. I'm saying for me personally, I wasn't satisfied with where I was at. While I haven't still, quote unquote, fixed my job yet, I'm still working the same one. What I decided to do here was I took a move. I moved out of the house, and I actually moved from a suburb. I moved to a small community a little deeper in the woods. Right now I'm living on a lake in my state, so it's been a really nice change. Getting my own personal space, doing all my own stuff. Not having to like split household chores and duties, just like let's do it all. Let's get everything. So there's going to be some time and some effort lost, and it's like when I was going at my peak, I was doing at least a 3 or 4 day a week stream. A lot of those days now are just dedicated to other things.
Yeah, I think I saw something recently about how being in nature has some connection, right? Some correlation to happiness. And I think that living on a lake would be fantastic if I were to guess. And it has to have been good for your mental state.
It's absolutely been a blessing to my mental state just being up here on a lake and up in nature a little further. Um, I'm not going to play the cop out because I've never been diagnosed, so I have no idea, the formalities and the ins and out, and I don't really have a right to talk about it, but you could say, like, I was just constantly bummed out. Now, I don't know if you want to call that anxiety, depression, whatever you may have it, but for a long time, especially during my most recent stint with Pauper and Blue Black Delver, I was largely using it as, whether you want to say, a source of self-esteem or otherwise just a crutch to lean on. Sorry, it's just to hold me up, keep me going. Make it through the day, get some, do your work, get money, all that jazz. Just like, kind of like an autopilot thing. And one of the things that has helped me grow just as a person is, now that I kind of stepped away from streaming all the time and, pounding out Pauper matches left and right, I feel a little bit better just making it through each and every single day. I know I'm still doing the same job that I might not absolutely love at this point, but I come home, I go to a lake, I hop in the water, I take a bike ride around, sometimes I hop in a kayak. It's a little breath of fresh air just to go out and do other things. And then on top of that, my physical health, it's still not the best, but it's definitely gotten better since those days of sitting in the chair for 12 hours every Sunday playing the challenge. It just feels like a general good change that I made. So I'm kind of happy that I stepped forward to do that.
And I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy for you that you've improved your personal life. That's great to hear. Now, speaking just a little bit about, well, we're still on the topic of you. I want to learn a bit about how you started playing Magic. How did you discover this game?
Oh man, so we have to reel it all the way back. I've been playing for Magic for more than half my existence at this point. But my first Magic memory was, I remember being, I forget if it was a 9 or a 10-year-old. It was, maybe it might have even been 11 based on the release date. But my first thing I remember was, I was in the mall, and I was just being a bored, dirtily kid. I had Pokemon cards at that point and such, but they didn't have any booster packs left at the GameStop, so my grandmother in at that point in time was just like, well, hey, just take one of these. It'll be just as good. And it was a pack of Onslaught, and I remember cracking it, and actually it might have been maybe it was Legions. It was Onslaught Block. It was whatever set Mistform Ultimus was in, because that was the first card I remember cracking out of a pack. I think it was Legions.
I feel that's the Legions card.
Yeah, maybe I was 11 or 12, but point is, I was young, and like from there, I was already dirtling around at the local shop. I was doing they had like a cute Pokemon thing when that game was still fresh and new. Now there's like 600 of them or more. But back in the day, there was, you try to fight for your gym badge every week by playing games with all the other 8-year-olds. It was cute. It was fun. But that kind of started it, and then from there, I just kind of kept playing in some interest in some semblances card games. I mean, I guess a little bit of my background, not to go into full psychology here, but I'm from a single parent home. Single mothers tend to want to not make sure their children go and wreck themselves, because then they can't afford between the time off work and the cost of insurances and stuff. So I wasn't exactly allowed to just go out and hop on a quad or go play football or this and that. So computers and card games were always considered this is fine and safe. So I've been, part of me as an adult was molded from that upbringing, and my hobbies and interests still largely reflect that.
Yeah, I think we started playing pretty much right around the same time then. Now, that said, it took me quite some time before I personally discovered Pauper. Tell me about that transition for you when you discovered Pauper.
Pauper was a really interesting point just because I'm with Pauper, I would say that I discovered it. I really started looking into it probably around late 2017. I hadn't really played beforehand, really looked into it, this or that. I had, at that point, I was just still playing MTGO for other reasons and other formats like Modern and such. You know, a new set would come out. Every once a year I'd pop in and check in. But what I had decided to do was after, I think the deck that drew me to it was in fact Mono Blue Delver at that point in time. But yeah, after just playing some games and just seeing like, oh well, this is kind of sweet. It's all commons. It's all eternal. I could be like a legacy or a vintage collection. I'll still have to dump some money into it, but I won't have to dump an oppressive amount of money like the other formats still have to deal with. And that's kind of what drew me to Pauper to begin with was, hey, I could play this eternal format without and without having to completely destroy my bank. I could just scrap all the commons from the new sets and stuff and just, go it from there. Um, and even within Pauper, even though I started playing a year before I made my version, however you care, Blue Black Delver, UBXD, um, I I even for the first year I even kind of in and out of the format myself. There'd be weeks I'd play and then I'd put it down for 3-4 months, then I'd come back. Um, so I would say though the part and the allure to me about Pauper was that it's an affordable eternal format and there's you know that similar to like the professor would say and maybe many others would say, that to me is the joy of it, is saying yes, I could have everything and that I don't have to buy it all again because they're just commons and they're not high price tags compared to say a dual land in vintage or legacy or a piece of power in vintage.
Yeah, I think in some ways you in answering my previous question have already answered my next question, and I also personally know the answer having remembered it from your streams in the past. But the next question I generally want to be asking my guests is simply, what made you stay with Pauper?
Well, what made me stick around with Pauper for the stretch that I did, which was largely about a year ago, the end of last summer, all the way through this winter, spring, was that I did create, or I did my take on, I'd helped develop, I guess is the most correct way to phrase it, the deck or archetype known as Blue Black Delver, or as I like to call it, UBXD. So I guess I'll just talk about that for a little bit. It started off at last summer. I believe there is a player by the name of Ironic Gentleman, and maybe some others. There was someone else too. I can't remember the name. Forgive me. Credit them, please. But they had made this sweet deck that popped up in a 5.0, and I believe in a challenge for that matter. And it was just a blue-based tempo deck that ran black, and those are always some of my favorite colors in Magic in general. But one thing that I liked about it is things I liked about it. One, it got to play Gurmag Angler, which like other decks in the format just weren't at this time. And two, it just felt generally disruptive as a tempo deck compared to the other standard tempo decks at the time, which were Mono Blue Delver and Blue Red Delver. But yeah, what ultimately happened here was I looked at it and I was just, I saw its potential and I'm like, well, this is a good starting, this is good framework. We're just going to develop it from here. It was called UB One Drops because famously the deck at its inceptions literally was just one drops. The idea is everything could be played for 1 mana. And what my development or what I did to tweak it out and change it over time was I added 2 drops. Some people would call that UB2D or what have you. And I just kind of got, whether you want to say fed up with or sick of all the name calling on it. So I just started to call it UBXD. X being the variable, D stands for drops, blue-black, still blue-black. You could call it Blue-Black Delver. You could call it whatever you want. I call it a beast because that's what that deck was. But yeah, that's kind of the point that kept me going in the format. Was I was having a lot of success developing that in that format, which was last end of summer into fall, and that sort of carried and accelerated in the winter as well.
Yeah, and I do believe, to the best of my knowledge, you have attributed that deck correctly. Ironic Gentleman most definitely had the rough draft of this deck, and I don't want to presume who he worked with on that, but I do feel as if there was another person who was working on the original version of the monster that you helped to create.
Yeah, I can't think of the name, but I know there was someone else working on it, and I want to give whoever that may be full credit. I just don't have the name, but I know there was somebody that was putting a lot of effort into the one drops.
Yeah, I it's one of those things where I'm trying to be journalistic here, so I don't want to say I think it's this person. I have a name in mind, but I can't say whether or not it's accurate, so I'm just going to have to hold that one in. I would hate to give an attribution such as this to someone who had nothing to do with it, right? Credit where credit is due would be ideal. So I'm with you. I remember absolutely Ironic. Shout out to Ironic for the rough draft of what would later be the archetype, more or less behind 3 bands. Yeah, and just since it's been a while since, you've been in the space, let's talk real fast about Blue Monday, when Gush, Probe, and Daze disappeared. What was your reaction to that?
All right, so my reaction was ultimately that's what I wanted, I think, this whole time as a player, going back to age 13. That's what I wanted out of this game. To look at a card or look at a format and just say that in some capacity, I felt like I put in the work or I put in the effort, that I could look at that ban list, that eternal ban list, and just say, I like these cards that have made their way onto this. I am the reason behind this, or I am the large factor behind that. Obviously it's not just me, it's tons of people playing the same deck, but being the one who forefronted and powered through and really making that, I could look at it and, whatever, talk about my ego or whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, I could look at it and say, that was me. And that was my big initial reaction about them. I guess real quick, just to talk about the lead up. Last summer, the end of last summer and last fall, specifically before UMA, I really felt the format was in a really good place, and Blue-Black Delver was a great deck, but it wasn't oppressive. What really changed the scape of this format, and what really brought it all together, was that UMA moment when they decided to downshift foil. That was what really set everything ablaze and set the Pauper format on fire.
I could not agree more, and that was the point in time which everyone started playing more than 2 copies of Gush. I think previous to that, I was the only guy that was on 3 copies of Gush. I was on 3 copies of Gush for previously when that card was allowed, pretty much every blue-based deck that I played that had some number of Gush in it, the minimum number I would run was 3. That was true for my Is It Delver, the first Pauper finish with my name next to it. When the first time I played the challenge, I took 13th with 3 copies of Gush. I was the only guy who had more than 2 copies of Gush that day. And the first time that the first time I really played Blue-Black XD, the week after you and I played in the top 8, when I was on Boros Bully, the week right after I played Blue-Black XD in the challenge, and I had 3 copies of Gush that day as well. So I really feel like prior to foil, people were just 2 Gush was good enough for everyone, and immediately that number doubled upon the downshift of foil.
Yeah, and one thing that brief aside here, when I'm saying about I could point at cards and say that was me, I'm leaning less so on Gush because Gush over a lot of different decks, way over time. That was just a very exploitable and good card. You know, it wasn't just the deck I was playing and its synergies, but like between Tribe, between Blitz, between Mono Blue, Blue Red, you name it. If it could jam basic islands, like Gush probably should have been played in it in some capacity. I don't take full credit for Gush, but I definitely take credit for Daze, and I take credit for Get Probe.
That's interesting. Do you feel like the Daze ban? So my thing is, I believe Daze is different than those other two cards, right? Gataxian Probe and Gush being essentially sorcery speed cards that are free that give you an immediate advantage. Whereas Daze is not in that same category of card. While it is still a quote free spell, end quote, it's something that's never played in the main phase. Well, I shouldn't say that. That is very infrequently, or was very infrequently played in main phases. So it's really not like the other two. So what are your thoughts on Gush being, sorry, not Gush. What are your thoughts on Daze being included with those other two?
I think one of the reasons you get to see some of these less card draw based linear aggression strategies seep through now in the current meta, that's been largely a result of the Daze ban. Now, as for making Temple playable or unplayable, I'm still uncertain, and I don't feel overly qualified to say if Daze is the proverbial nail in the coffin for Temple. But Daze has been a large offender just because not only did it produce like non-games, there were just times where it felt really bad. Like, you know, the typical, okay, what am I going to flip off a Delver? Oh, I'll flip Daze off a Delver, but, by the way, I already have a Delver on board that's flipped, and maybe I already tapped out Frog or Bolas that turn. In terms of if it needed to go, there's a lot of this. A lot of people say it didn't. A lot of people say it did. I'm somewhere in between. Unfortunately, I wish I could give you the yes, it definitely had to, or no, it definitely didn't. But on that one, I'm on the fence.
And that's why I think it's such an interesting discussion piece because, again, it seems to be in a different category than the other cards that were banned that same day.
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, one thing that can definitely be said is it's definitely tampered blue-black and blue's power level to the point where, barring based Mezzle, very few people have success with the tempo decks right now in the current format. We'll get into that and such, but yeah, Daze was quite the interesting ban there. But one of the main things teetering it back or going back to it was with UMA introduced, I hadn't hesitated and I kind of put my money where my mouth is, and I let foil rip the very first week, and I ended up 9-1ing that challenge, winning it, dropping one match that I punted in Swiss. Could have been a 10-0, wasn't a 10-0, but yeah, I immediately went to the bank with it, and that sort of jump started my streak or my desire to just see how far could I push it, how many weeks in a row could we do this. And that kind of definitely led to these bans in question. Not just me and my playing, but just everybody realizing that either at that point in time had to play Blue-Black Delver, or you had to play Boros Bully, and if you didn't, you were just hitting percentage points out the gates down on your ability to win a tournament.
I would like to point out that because of that dichotomy that was created at one point, mainly the point where I came back into the format after I took a break, let's call it middle of December through middle of March, taking a break from essentially Magic in general, although I did play some Vintage Cube during that time period, albeit very little for myself. That White-Black Pestilence was definitely a third option, and strictly speaking, I believe C is for Cookie had 30-some trophies, which was twice the next guy with elves. So that dichotomy sort of, the metagame adjusted a little bit, and there were some decks that did prey on everyone playing one or the other. I also, if I remember correctly, Burn became more and more popular as people were get probing, so recklessly. Although, obviously, you and I both know that Burn was a fantastic matchup for Blue-Black XD, thanks, at least in part, to Daze. So, yeah, that dichotomy was most certainly created, but as a lot of metagames go, players find a way to adapt and maybe not necessarily overcome, but there were a few other options eventually.
Yeah, you could play any deck in the format. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an eternal format. You just really have to ask yourself, and this is kind of where my inner Spike shines, am I looking to win a few games or matches, or am I looking to win an event? Because at that point in time, you could certainly, as described, take a 5-0 through a league with an elves, or you could take, you could sometimes get a 4-1 or even put up a decent result with a burn deck or something like that, or this and that. And there were fringe options, but largely by not picking one of those two decks, you are just saying, okay, my odds of winning this event, which could be minuscule as is, right, are now taking at least another 5% hit by just not picking one of these. And I think that was the core of the problem, and I think that's where the bans ended up getting justification.
Ironically, it's important to mention the archetype that Birdman created towards the end there with the Thepmos High Priest version of Tireless Tribe, where that deck straight up wrecked Blue-Black XD. However, it also played 4 Probe, 4 Gush, 4 Daze, so kind of the same problem from from Wizards' standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely saw Burb have success in leagues with it, and I'm certainly not discrediting Burb as a Tron player or deck builder. He's definitely one of the newer Pauper content pushers that kind of emerged around the same time I started. You should go check him out. I think his Twitch is Entropy 263, if I'm not mistaken. But Burb, man.
So that's the player name that he uses on MTGO. He does Twitch as Birdman263.
Oh, apologies. So his Twitch is Birdman263. But yeah, you should go check him out. He's solid. He knows what he's doing. And I'm sure we'll talk about Burb again a little later. But yeah, even that though, if you looked and you watched some of his streams that he was doing, I'm not convinced that Blue-Black Delver was... I'm not saying it was unbearable like a lot of the other decks, but I'd be hard-pressed to say it was favorable for that deck.
My understanding is it was quite poor for Blue-Black XD. I know that when I played against Burb on Blue-Black XD, and I feel like I was, at a minimum, a competent pilot of Blue-Black XD. Truth be told, the first time I ever played it, I felt like I was made to play that deck. It was so intuitive that I top-8'd the challenge after playing the deck for 3 days. Right? Losing in the mirror to the God Draw, but that's irrelevant. I felt like I can say that I was a competent pilot of that archetype at a minimum, somewhere between very good and competent. I felt so outclassed in my interactions against that High Priest deck. It was, in my estimations, a terrible matchup for Blue-Black XD, and I believe that was Birdman's take on it as well. And we can absolutely shout out Birdman as much as we want because, spoilers, he's the next guest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it'll be good to hear that one too, what becomes of that talk. The main thing with that, where I was just going with that, is I swear that I've seen him, and I'm not going to go, I don't have the time these days to go digging through his VODs and whatnot, but there was definitely 1 or 2 challenges that the nail in the coffin to his run with that blue-white deck was blue-black Delver. So I'm really just saying it based off of that. I mean, end of the day, it could... Burb knows very well what he's doing, and depending on the proficiency of the blue-black Delver pilot, I could see it being a horrible matchup, like you're saying, if you don't know what you're doing or you're not prepared to battle it in the manner you should be.
I mean, I feel like I knew what I was doing, and I still was incredibly outclassed. But truth be told, Birdman is one of the absolute best Pauper players, and I feel like I'm a tier down from that. I believe I'm one of the better Pauper players out there, and he's one of the best. So really, he could probably beat me with 56 islands, a couple of ham sandwiches, and a pair of used socks.
It's so true. It's so true. Now that being said, what I was going to mention is one thing that always impressed me about Burb is just the speed of his ability on using MTGO.
Yeah, it's crazy.
If you ever just watch him, he clicks and interacts way faster. Now, I get the whole fast binds and this and that, but like he almost has it down to robot level of like, get this, that, the next thing done. Shout out for the 5th time to Burb because he generally knows what's going on here. I like Burb a lot.
I do as well, and his positivity is undeniable in terms of what he does for the format. The only other player that I've ever encountered that is both proficient and fast at that same level was Obzin. If you've ever played against Obzin, he played pretty much exclusively Snow Go, which is one of the least intuitive decks out there. But my God, man, he used to play Snow Go faster than I would play whatever I was playing against him, and I'd be playing decks like Slivers or some other deck with creatures that attacked, and he would just always be so much faster playing a 5-color hard control, like Keeper style control, like old school style control, a deck that someone probably shouldn't be playing at lightning speed. And the same is true for Birdman. I mean, it's Tron usually with him, and most players take their time with these things, but he just knows what the right play is, and it's awfully intimidating usually on the other side of that.
Yeah, like definitely in my heyday of challenges, Burb was not one of the players that I wanted to see, just because he would play. I have a tendency to just play slower as is, admittedly. That would definitely be one of the strikes or knocks on me as a player. And is just, again, basically a machine in terms of moto and playing things properly and proficiency with the Tron archetype. So, yeah, he's definitely one of the end bosses when it comes to the Pauper format on MTGO.
Absolutely, could not agree more. Not that long ago, I had a situation where I got put into a tough spot on MTGO. I guess this was a few months ago, but I literally just set the keyboard down and went away and came back like 4 minutes later, and I knew what I wanted to do. And I think that his version of that would be like 10, 12 seconds.
Exactly. He's just so fast with just, let's decide to do this. Okay, you're up. Go. Like, it's marvelous. Check him out sometime for anybody listening. If you haven't already, check him out.
Could not agree more. And we definitely want to use this space to promote Pauper's best content creators, and he is that right now. With we've lost some fantastic people in the past year, and luckily we still have some other great content creators. And I think you and I are in agreement that anyone who's unfamiliar with Birdman should check him out. But, we'll have him on the pod next week. So, I'll speak more to him at that point and more about his platform at that point. I want to move on to, we have a schedule. I'm gonna reverse to them. Let's talk about your perceptions of the current state of the format, and then let's get into the results from yesterday.
Okay. Yeah, no, that works for me. And yeah, what I would say about the current format is let's put myself aside and my feelings on the human level. Looking at the format and results, I would just say that it's clear right now the ephemerate card itself is the main. You either need to play it or you need to beat it. Like, that is the first thing that strikes me about this format. And I get that's kind of a general statement to say the whole format's kind of around one card, but unfortunately, I feel it really is boiled down to that and its current state of affairs. Now, there's other problems or other cards and other archetypes within the format, but Ephemerate is the big one that strikes me.
I think that is a very valid assessment. If you're not casting Ephemerate, you sure need to be beating it.
Right, it's such a neat tool because not only with Archaeomancer is it a card draw engine, or Mnemonic Wall is it a card draw engine. At the same merit, though, it's also just, it serves as a low-key counterspell to removal. If somebody's trying to do, generally the idea is you play it and then they bait out the removal in response, but it's flexible in the sense that it could be a counterspell to a removal spell. It's just a really good card. It's undercosted.
It's definitely undercosted.
Whether it should be in the format, whether it should exist or not, I don't feel I'm qualified to say right now, but I think that's the main card that's single-handedly defining it. Now, I guess one thing to be clear for anybody who hasn't interacted with me in the past, seen streams of mine, this or that, one of my emotes was what I like to call Pizzatron, and the reason behind it was Tron. I don't like Tron. That's the short and the sweet of it. I always felt it produced non-games for both the Tron player and the person across from it. So I have a large problem with Tron in general. So the next cards that I'm about to kind of lay into.
Yeah, so I'm just going to take this moment to say that I think there are things that are good for the game, and I think there are things that are bad for the game, and that's true for all games. That's true for all communities. To give a little bit more of depth to what I'm trying to say, at the local game store level, someone who would be good for the game is someone who says "good game" after they lose and they mean it. Someone who lends out decks to new players. Someone who, maybe they take some time and help someone starting out build their first deck. That's all great for the game. That's all fantastic for the game. And on the flip side of that, someone who is salty when they lose, someone who berates new players for being noobs, who says something like, "You got so lucky to win. You don't deserve this." People like that are bad for the game. So I think we can agree there are things that are good for the game and things that are bad for the game. Now, again, this platform isn't about me expressing my opinions. I am going to just say I have a very firm opinion on Tron that I'm not going to share. But I think that we can agree most certainly there are things that are good for the game and there are things that are bad for the game. And I absolutely loved the Pizzatron emote. It was hilarious.
Well, thank you. I think I have to credit Raptor for that one, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure he's the one who did that for me, Raptor56.
Yeah, quick shout out to Raptor56. If you're tuning in, man, hope everything's going well for you. Raptor was originally going to be the co-host of this podcast.
I see. A valid co-host there. He knows what he's doing with Pauper, so I like Raptor, and
another one of the best. Hopefully
that could come to fruition. Exactly. But yeah, what I would say here is with Tron, it just produces a lot of games where I'm going to take it one step back. One of the things that was decided by this ban and bans in the past is that mana, spells have to either cost mana or, in different words, there could only be so much cheating on mana allowed in the format. And I think the core of the issue with Tron is that the deck inherently cheats on mana, in the sense that I could play 3 lands and have 3 mana, you could play 3 lands as the Tron player, you have 7 mana.
Well, everyone knows 1 + 1 + 1 = 7, Nasty.
Well, yeah, I learned that the hard way. But that being said, aside from the Tron lands just simply existing, some of the tools that it got out of this Modern Horizons set have been problematic towards other archetypes existing, namely Weather the Storm being a huge knock on, if you're a Tempo player like I've been historically, whether it be mono blue, blue red, blue black, you name it, what have you, Weather the Storm has been a real big problem in letting Tempo players finish out games. and that's one of the cards that Tron is in a position to abuse the most because of its excess of mana, being able to cast an excess of spells, and in turn, being able to just say, oh, I cast 4 spells this turn, I gain 12 life. Like, what are you going to do as a temple player that exhausted or gassed your entire resources to put them at, 5 life or 3 life? It doesn't line up very well. And then, of course, there's other things. I've already tacked on Ephemerate, the Tron lands. The only other core, or the only other thing that I could really think of, um, I guess what I just don't, this one's going to be going down in the rabbit hole where some people, and I would say a lot of people for that matter, feel like Astrolabe is a problem. I'm not sure if I'm sold on it one way or the next yet. Again, it could just be my lack of repetitions in the current format. But that's another card that a lot of people are calling for the head on.
Yeah, what's interesting is that of Modern Horizons, if we're going to talk about powerful cards, I believe there are 5 powerful cards from Modern Horizons. There's Ephemerate, there's Astrolabe, there's Weather the Storm, and there's additionally Savage Swipe and Winding Way. From a power level standpoint, I would think Weather might be the most power, either Ephemerate or Weather, like in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. One of those has to be the most powerful. I think that third place it has to be Winding Way, and then I guess Astrolabe, then I guess Savage Swipe after that from a power level standpoint. So if I'm going to make a conditional statement, if Astrolabe winds up seeing play in 90% of all decks and becomes ubiquitous, then Wizards is most definitely going to do something about that. I remember that's what wound up happening with Brainstorm in Vintage way back in the day. Everyone played 4 Brainstorm. Every single deck played 4 Brainstorm unless you used Mishra's Workshop and you simply weren't making blue mana. You played 4 copies of Brainstorm. So it was in, call it 95% of all decks, and Wizards did something about that because it became ubiquitous. I feel that may come to pass, right? Again, I'm not making my personal thoughts on this. That's not what this space is about. It's just that I do think there's a precedent that's been set in the past for cards which become ubiquitous. And since it's an artifact, well, Astrolabe has the most potential of those cards to become ubiquitous. Bringing it back to the Tron discussion, it's interesting that 3 of those 5 cards that we got to play with in the format, Tron got to pick up, as if they want as many copies as they want, because they get to play Tron can play whatever they want, really. So yeah, they've chosen to adapt Ephemerate, they've chosen to adapt Astrolabe, and they've chosen to adapt Weather the Storm in at least some builds.
Well, given that one of the other problems that I had even before Astrolabe was Tron generally has had better mana, like colored mana, than a 2-color deck as a deck that plays 12 colorless lands. And that's largely before Astrolabe. The offender of that was Prophetic Prism. Really, it's a no-brainer to just say, like, hey, I'm just going to slot 4 extra copies of Prophetic Prism in this deck. No problem. So, I mean, that just further, that just furthers it out. And, with Tron already, many versions of Tron, or the successful versions of Tron running mystical teachings as was, you figure that these new flashy instants, like, hey, I got a slot for you, I got a slot for you, you get a slot, you get a slot, everybody gets a slot. Like, it's kind of like it's on a sick version of Oprah where Tron just gets to go ahead and reign supreme and everybody gets pizza. Like, I don't know what else to say. So I'm a little jaded towards the whole Tron, but I mean, in general, Ephemerate, I would say, is the card that's probably solo defining the format, because opposite of the Tron lands, the other deck that's having a lot of success is the Jeskai Ephemerate deck, which largely just uses Ephemerate as a source to blink the enter the battlefield effects, like Archaeomancer, namely, and other ones. to just gain a critical mass of cards in hand. Your entire graveyard is kind of a renewable resource. It's also low-key a counterspell. It's just, in general, that is probably the card defining the format right now. Like, in terms of how to fix that or if it's fair or not, that's more of a feeling thing on people, and I'm not. Again, I haven't had the reps to say one way or the next whether it should or shouldn't be. Looking at it, I don't. On paper, the deck doesn't look overly oppressive. It just looks like a solid, good, mid-rangey deck. But I could see arguments being made in any direction on it.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about Jeskai is there are at least 6 flavors which have found success. I am counting the version that I qualified for the playoffs as well in that, even though literally no one else has ever played that. Like, it got ignored. It could not have been ignored harder, perhaps in part to me not running Ephemerate at all in my 75, which I have to admit was more of a metagame decision that day. Early, I looked up every single player in the field on MTG Goldfish's player search function, doing my best to figure out how they qualified for the event, what archetypes they liked to have played previously, based off their most recent tournament finishes in Pauper, and then I just made a tally sheet next to decks that I thought would represent the metagame. So that was, I played 2 main deck copies of Fire and Ice that day, even though I don't think Fire and Ice is any good at this time in the metagame, and that had a lot to do with me counting 14 Fairies players and a minimum of 4 Elves players. Out of the 70 registered players, I knew Fire and Ice would be bonkers against a minimum of 18 of them. So that's a fair percentage.
Yeah.
So
that is a fair percentage, and I think that's reasonable. Like, I know Fire and Ice uses a deck slot and all, but I think that was a one well used.
Yes, so it was just one of those things where I made some decisions that morning, right? And I just didn't have room for Ephemerates. I also wanted to remove my graveyard to drop Anglers because there were quite a few known Affinity players, quite a few known Stompy players, and the original Jeskai Astrohawk list, shout out to Sakura for creating that, was fairly weak to those 2 archetypes in my testing the week previous, and I wanted to have main deck answers to Affinity and Stompy, which I did play against both those in the challenge, or not the challenge, in the playoff that day, and I did 2-0 both those, largely in part to dropping turn 4 Anglers. So you don't necessarily even need Ephemerate, I think is the point I'm making, but it's advisable. I would play Ephemerate. In fact, I do, right? I made room for it.
Yeah, cards really good. There's no, we could go on and on about it. Card's super good. Play Ephemerate, win games, all that jazz. Pick your flavor of Ephemerate, or if not, the other one or the other side of it is try to pick one of the decks that quote-unquote go under it, or, can't grind out the long game like Ephemerate can. Largely, we haven't seen any new developments aside from Ephemerate. Like, there are decks that have innovated a little bit here and there. One we'll be talking about later in the grand scheme of things in Boggles, but I would say that largely these other decks haven't so much adapt. When I say other decks, I mean like Stompy, Elves, Boggles, Burn, White Heroic, Mono Black, even the Tempo decks that with the few players that still play them, Skred Delver, Mono Blue Delver. There's not a whole lot of changes or movement being made in a lot of those other archetypes. The biggest thing to come out of Modern Horizons was this Jeskai Ephemerate and Tron being, on a different power level per se than the rest of the power consistency level than the rest of the format. And I think that's what I would take on it. Those are still the front runners. Those are still the dogs to beat. You could play something else, but yeah, it's basically race Ephemerate or otherwise play it.
think that's an absolutely fair assessment of the format at this time, and I do think that the MCQ results are indicative of that assessment, and I'm most certainly ready to discuss those as well. It do want to mention that yesterday's tournament was large. 214 players showed up to battle it out for an invitation to essentially not play Pauper, which is why I know I didn't play the MCQ, but congratulations to the winner, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Yositos. No, that can't be right. Yosito Shekel would be my guess on how to pronounce your name. Congratulations on winning the most prestigious Pauper tournament of 2019.
Yeah, I mean, this one was on par with size of the LA MCQ. So yeah, I would say congratulations, and quite the deck choice. We could either start here or we could wrap up with it. But yeah, he won this thing. He took it down with with one of the classic strategies that I was mentioning before of Boggles. His take on it and what's evolved with Boggles, I guess we'll just go right into it. So what's evolved on Boggles and what's interesting in this is now it's just jamming the full set of Astrolabes in here, which was a fairly easy inclusion, as well as to prevent some of the flyover. It's also running the core Skyfishers, just that part of the engine to rebuy Astrolabes. You could rebuy Abundant Growth, draw another card, perhaps. I guess those are the main purposes behind it. Just a little extra card draw and a little extra air defense, but they slot in quite nice. And we've seen this come from time to time. We've seen this card included in the list, but one thing that this person did, this person really went heavy on Fling, and I kind of really do like that as a way to get around some of these Tron moment of peace stalls, or some of the other things occurring, like game one versus the Jeskai deck, who's constantly tapping out for things. Fling is a really sweet inclusion to just say, hey, here's my big dude, now it's in your face.
Yeah, I think that has, at least in part, something to do with the stone horns that are becoming popular in Tron decks at this time. I also think that it's worth noting he's only on 2 copies of Ledgewalker because there are so many flyers running around at this time.
Yeah, there's a lot of flyers. Ledgewalker isn't nearly as attractive as it used to be. What's it matter? You just need the dude big and bashing. That's the main where it kind of stands right now. I mean, at a glance, it looks like all it really shaved off for this is like maybe 1 land and a couple Cartouche solitarities that would have been in this same deck, say, 4, 5, 6 months ago. Ironically, the one that won the MCQ, right? Well, that one was a little more mono green and such, but we're not going to go too far on a tangent on that. That being said, it's interesting to just look at it and say, we've been talking this narrative of, play Ephemerate and do this or do that, and Tron's a big bully. Tron cheats on the mana principles of the format, and then at the end of the day, the good old, draw, just play cards off the top of the deck, make a big dude smash, takes it all. So it's kind of interesting to see there are some silver linings despite all the negative things that we could preach about Pauper, that there is some still, it is an eternal format and eternal strategies are still existing.
I think it still slots into the dichotomy that we spoke of earlier, where you either need to play Ephemerate or you need to beat Ephemerate. At this time, the Jeskai decks rely heavily on Skred and rebuying their Skreds with Archaeomancer. So really, Hexproof is pretty well positioned, especially because I'm not really seeing any. Let me look through this top 8 one more time, but I don't think I saw too many copies of Standard Bearers or too many copies of Leave No Traces in these deck lists. And there's certainly I certainly did not see any of was that Serene Heart, like the actual hoser. Like, I don't see any actual hosers in these sideboards.
From what it seems like is everybody, or not, I shouldn't say everybody, a lot of these other players were on the right idea where they have a copy of Bearer, or they have a copy of Leave No Trace or 2 copies of Leave No Trace. It looks like in the rest of this top 8. But the thing here, though, is that if that's the case, that's all fine and well. But two problems with that. One, Fling kind of says this story or does this thing where it's like, well, I don't really care how many copies of removal when I'm just gonna, throw my creature at your face in response. That's one way around it. The other thing is, in general, like if you're gunning to beat a really niche strategy like Boggles, it's kind of like the what do you want to say, like the dredge theory in Vintage or Legacy, where it's like I either have the 6 to 8 sideboard slots dedicated in beating dredge, and I'll never lose to a dredge pilot, or I just have to hope that I don't see this type of deck, and I'm going to severely skimp and only use very, very fringe cards to otherwise deal with this deck. And reasonably so, it looks like a lot of people chose the latter, but the problem was the winner decided to play the Boggles deck and seemingly breezed his or her way to the coveted win here.
Yeah, I am going to eat my words. I do see 2 copies of Serene Heart in the sideboard in the top 16. Looks like Dissonance played 2 copies of Serene Heart, which Dissonance is usually has his finger on the pulse of the metagame. He's a fantastic player, and I'm not really surprised that he was packing 2 copies of Serene Heart and that he was on pace with what the metagame was going to be, where he knew that Boggles was good enough for him to include hate cards. There's also 1 copy in the 16th place finishing affinity list. So I'm going to eat those words. Some people were prepared in the field. So there were definitely some people that were ready that day for the Boggles, a boogeyman.
Yeah, it definitely looks like, whether you want to say it overperformed compared to expectations or just simply had a very good showing that day. I mean, I guess the core of the problem that I have with that type of archetype, and I kind of somewhat unfairly lumped it into all the other type of deck archetypes, I generally have problems where if the deck I'm playing can't see or draw more cards, that I feel like there's less decisions to be made on my part, so that's why I tend to stray away from these types of decks. But one of the recent developments, like I was saying, is that they have added, both Astrolabe to the deck, and that there was already a little bit of card draw, I believe with the one enchantment, I think it's Abundant Growth, so that you mitigate, and the Skyfishes, of course, rebuying the formers. You have some extra card draw in the deck now, so there are a few. Now, granted, you're still gunning the same game plan of make big dudes smash or fling. There's at least a little more play to it. Like, you're not just dead drawing, which a lot of these other decks are guilty of once you reach a certain turn in the game.
Now, looking through the top 8 lists, is there anything that strikes your fancy? Is there anything that you think is neat? Is there anything that you would like to spend a little bit of time, just discussing for how interesting the inclusions are? I know in my case, Bilster's deck I like. I did have the opportunity to know about it prior to this. My understanding is Bilster played a deck designed by Kung Fu Trees, and Kung Fu Trees, to my understanding, had a 30-5 record with his deck in leagues, although he played it as well in the MCQ and did not fare as well as Bilster did. And on the subject of Bilster, let's just take a moment and recognize that in all 3 of the most prestigious Pauper events held online, Bilster's worst finish is 5th in all 3 of the most prestigious events. What a beast.
Yeah, Bilster's definitely a beast when it comes to playing too. We talk about who is or who was or who may be the Pauper end bosses. At least during my grind, Bilster was certainly one of them. Janice Stone being another one. We could go on and on and on. But yeah, I mean, what's neat about, I guess what I wanted to comment on, and we'll start with Bilsters, is just the sheer versatility of the Jeskai Ephemerate archetype makes it a really, really big draw to it. So what I mean by that is, you could flex on or select card choices in certain ways, similarly to how Bilster's doing. Bilster went with the prismatic strands, the Rain of Revelation, the Thraben Inspector instead. That's all fine and well. I like to see things go a little bit differently, and that might even be a quote unquote getcha type of thing. Um, so I could see that especially between the prismatic strands. I don't know how high I am on a Rain of Revelation. Again, I don't have the proper reps in right now, but I could see that being an okay inclusion, especially game one before dispels get involved. And you scroll down, and just a couple other quick shoutouts, like my buddy Pascal here. He went with the Pulsa Marasa. That looks really good to me. He decided to include a couple Spell Stutter sprites. I don't have too much of an opinion other than Spell Stutter Sprite has always historically been a great card, so that probably got quite a few people. The Cheeky Dispel, love that. That's always a holdover from the good old days of Blue Black Delver. I guess what I like about this, though, is there's all sorts of different inclusions. Like, some are running Trinket Mage, some are running Glint Hawk, some run a Fire Ice, some don't, some run, 8 artifacts, some run 4, some run graveyard removal, some don't. There's just a lot of flexibility in it, so I like that. I like that you can have that flexibility, and I like how there's these. While there's still somewhat of a core between Skred, Counterspell, Ephemerate, Preordain, and then Core Skyfisher and Archaeomancer, that the rest of and Astrolabe, all the other cards are kind of, we don't know what the best between all the other ones are. It's kind of like, well, which one's better, Boros Monarch or Boros Bully? I kind of get that vibe out of it, so that's kind of sweet to see as a deck, and it definitely makes it feel less oppressive that there are all these different ways to interact with it, or to play this card or not to play this card. So I mean, even though it didn't win the whole thing, I would definitely say this was a very big positive to cement its case to say Jeskai is the front runner of the format.
Yeah, I think there's beauty in the nuance as well, where there's not an optimized version of Jeskai. There's no right answer. I can also see the argument why some people don't like that, where there's another way of looking at it would be that it's tough to do wrong, right? It's tough to build Jeskai wrong, which
right. I would agree with that, and looking at it, I guess the thing that struck me the most out of all these is, and maybe it is my bias just towards Pascal, but I really do like the Pulsa Marasa in his list compared to a lot of the other ones. I think that goes a huge way. So if I had to pin it down or nail it to a single, like, let's talk or let's see one thing, that Pulse is going to do a lot of work against some of the other things. So I really like that card, but yeah, I'm with you there. There's a bunch of different ways to play this powerful archetype. You could look at it like, well, who really cares if I'm not playing it? Like, it's just some number of blue, red, and white cards with an occasional other color splashed in. But yeah, I could see both sides of it, where it's like, oh, well, this is another take on the Boros archetype or what have you, like that.
Yeah, to the absolute best of my knowledge, the Pulse of Marasa Spice was also a Sakura thing, right? The guy who put the guy who came up, with the original Astrohawk list, who took fourth in the challenge the first weekend these cards were all legal. My understanding is that he really likes the one Pulse Marasa. That was an addition of his. In his assessment, it's fantastic in a lot of ways because it's so versatile. It's so versatile against the entire field. It's great against Stompy. It's great against Burn. It's great in the Mirror. It's great against Tron. It's just a great card in general right now. And yeah, I mean, it's spicy. I can appreciate that flavor.
The other low-key thing that does is it's twofold, like you were saying about Tron, is one for yourself, what single Archaeomancer suddenly turns into your entire creatures in your graveyard having the ability to make it back on the battlefield by just chaining it similarly to how a Tron player would chain it. But the second fold and a little deeper down the rabbit hole is, if you manage to get Tron within so many life points with your lightning bolts, you could use your you could use your Pulsar Marasa to blank their Pulsar Marasa target, and that's just a kick in the face or a kick in the teeth to Tron. So that's the part that I really enjoy about it, because like they Pulsar Marasa whatever in their yard, and you target it in response, you gain the 6 life. They don't.
That's the tempo player and you appreciating that the most. Because
Oh
they
yeah,
still get the
no,
creature, right? They still get the creature?
right, but the 6 life is the problem.
No, I understand. I just recognizing that's the tempo player in you.
Yeah, that's definitely my inner tempo player speaking. So I agree with that. You know, I definitely biased towards just loving tempo decks.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We're going to start wrapping up here. This was a fantastic discussion, which I most thoroughly enjoyed having with you today. Before we go, we generally have 2 weekly segments. We have a play of the day and give Slivers a hilarious ability. Now, neither one of us played the challenge today, so I don't have a play of the day, but I understand you still have a very strong play to share.
Yeah, I definitely have a play of the day, and usually this kind of comes from my mouth and my general whatever, not backing down or just character. My play of the day and what I've done, at least in the past so many months, was went ahead and actually deleted the chat program on the MTGO client so that it's reflecting or akin to something on Hearthstone. I couldn't advise people who have a mouth like myself. I couldn't advise you do anything other than that. It's not too hard to do. Look into it. Just get the chat out of the game. It makes MTGO a way better experience. That being said, you were saying about the slivers, right? So it's like the other weekly thing is you want everybody to comment about all slivers, right?
Yeah, so
You see, mine I'm gonna akin or harken to my personal, which is all slivers have low APR rates because now I'm trying to actually buy and afford a lake house, and that APR is no bueno.
I can appreciate it. As someone who previously worked in the mortgage industry, that definitely brought a smile to my face.
Oh, well, right on. And, I appreciate all the kind words, Rusal. It's been a pleasure, my man.
Yeah, man, it's great catching up with you. It's definitely been a minute, and again, I can't thank you enough for reaching out to me to come on to the podcast. That was a tremendous surprise, and I'm so glad that you did. In the future, I would imagine that you will be back on the minute that you start playing, as I'm going to try to speak with people who have done well in events and who are helping to shape the metagame, and that's been your role in the past. So I would presume that will happen sometime over the course of the next 2 years that I'm going to be doing this. Again, this podcast is limited edition. I'm going to try to do it weekly for 100 episodes. There are going to be some breaks, especially around the holidays. But essentially, I'm going to be doing this thing for the next 2 years. I'll be shocked if you're not helping shape the metagame sometime during that time period.
Well, I appreciate that, and I would hope that this isn't my final stint with Magic or any of that. I mean, I don't foresee it being the end of the road, per se, for me. I'd hope to get back in the format eventually and make a few waves here and there. So I appreciate that, and I would hope I'm back on at that time, or who knows, even if you just need somebody for the week, I'd be happy to pop on in. But we'll play it by ear, and we'll see how it goes.
That's amazing, man. Again, thank you so much for joining me today on the Pauper Players Podcast.
Absolutely. Been a pleasure. Till next time.
All right, man. And there you have it. Episode 1 of the Pauper Players Podcast is in the books. Thank you again to Nasty for coming on and sharing this space with me today. In the future, I'm going to be incredibly mindful to keep these under 1 hour. I feel that 45 minutes to an hour is sort of the sweet spot in terms of listening, in terms of enjoyment for a podcast. I know that's what I would prefer myself to listen to. Next week, it was spoiled that we're going to have Birdman joining us in this space. Looking forward to that. If you're not familiar with him, please do take this time to familiarize yourself with him, as he makes fantastic content. Every single week, he streams the challenge on Sundays, and he has a few other streams throughout the week as well. As he also recently made a YouTube channel that you can find the link to on the right if you're listening to this on YouTube. After that, we have another multiple time challenge winner coming on, someone who also streams on Twitch. That sort of narrows it down. I feel like I may have spoiled who that person is, but we haven't heard from him in the recent months either, and I'm hoping to give him a chance to, talk about where he's been as well. After that, I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to start pursuing people who have done well either in the challenge or had a sweet list published in the weekly league results. I want to pick the brains of the people who are shaping the metagame. I want to pick the brains of the people who are helping to make the decks that many players simply copy and play themselves. So it's going to be a little bit of a change of pace, whereas the first 3 guests were lined up, and after that I'm not going to have anyone lined up. So I'm going to be sort of, how they have ambulance chasers? I'm going to have a challenge. I'm going to be a challenge winner chaser after that. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. This is Exile signing off. Cheers.